My name is Joaquin Restrepo, and I'm a food distributor who survived the first 90 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and blocked out the sun, I had to choose between saving strangers or protecting my warehouse full of food. Gangs wanted what I had, people were freezing to death, and every decision meant someone lived or died. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Restrepo, and I'm a food distributor who survived the first 90 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and blocked out the sun, I had to choose between saving strangers or protecting my warehouse full of food. Gangs wanted what I had, people were freezing to death, and every decision meant someone lived or died. I'm recording this from what used to be my distribution warehouse in Columbus, Ohio. Outside my window, the snow is piled 20 feet high against the loading docks, and the thermometer reads -18 degrees Fahrenheit during what should be the middle of the day. The sky hasn't been blue in 3 months. It's just this thick gray blanket of ash that makes noon look like twilight and midnight look like the end of the world. But let me tell you how this all started, because the signs were there if you knew where to look. I should have connected the dots, but who expects the world to end on a Tuesday morning while you're checking delivery routes with your coffee still hot? For 12 years, I worked my way up from loading trucks in the summer heat to managing regional food distribution for Midwest Fresh Foods. We supplied over 200 grocery stores, restaurants, and food banks across Ohio, Indiana, and parts of Kentucky. I coordinated 45 refrigerated trucks and supervised 80 drivers and warehouse workers. Every single day, I made sure fresh produce, canned goods, frozen foods, and dry goods got where they needed to go when they needed to be there. The job taught me to see patterns. Supply chain disruptions, weather delays, traffic problems, equipment failures. You learn to read the signs and plan 3 steps ahead, because when people are hungry, they don't want to hear excuses. They want solutions. September 14th, the day before everything changed, started like any other Monday. I arrived at the warehouse at 5:30 in the morning to review the overnight deliveries and plan the day's routes. My assistant manager, Carlos, had already pulled the manifests for our Tuesday runs. Everything looked normal except for one thing that should have been a red flag. We had 3 cancellations from our Western distributors. Not delays, not rescheduling, but complete cancellations of orders that had been locked in for months. These were major contracts with grocery chains in Wyoming and Montana. Companies don't just walk away from that kind of money without a reason. When I called our corporate headquarters in Chicago to ask about the cancellations, they told me it was a temporary adjustment due to regional supply issues. That was corporate speak for something's wrong, but we're not telling you what. I'd heard that phrase before during the early days of the pandemic, right before everything went sideways. Then around 10 o'clock that morning, I got a call that really should have made me pay attention. The Department of Agriculture contacted us directly about fulfilling an emergency contract for shelf-stable food supplies. Not fresh produce, not frozen goods, but canned vegetables, dried beans, rice, and other items with long shelf lives. They wanted enough to feed 5,000 people for 6 months, and they wanted it delivered to a FEMA staging area outside of Columbus within 72 hours. I'd never seen a government contract move that fast. Usually federal procurement takes weeks of paperwork and approvals. This felt like they were preparing for something specific, something they expected to happen soon. When I asked the procurement officer what the emergency was, he just said it was routine disaster preparedness. But you don't spend $2 million on routine anything. That afternoon, my drivers started calling in with reports that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Jake Morrison, one of my most experienced drivers who handled our Wyoming routes, called from near the Montana border. He said the ground had been shaking all week, not just little tremors but deep rumbling that made his truck vibrate even when he was parked. Local gas station attendants were talking about animals acting strange, birds flying in the wrong directions, dogs barking all night. My driver Maria Santos called from her route near Yellowstone National Park. She said the tourists were being evacuated from certain areas of the park, and there were more Park Service vehicles and scientists around than she'd ever seen. When she stopped for fuel, the station owner told her the Park Service had been buying up all the emergency supplies in town. Flashlights, batteries, first aid kits, anything that might be useful in a crisis. I should have put it together. Government emergency contracts, supply chain disruptions in the West, seismic activity, animal behavior changes, tourist evacuations. All the pieces were right there, but my brain kept defaulting to normal explanations. Earthquakes happen in that region. The government always has disaster preparedness exercises. Companies cancel contracts all the time for budget reasons. Looking back now, I think part of me didn't want to believe something that big could happen. It's easier to rationalize away warning signs than to accept that your entire world might be about to disappear. But the signs were screaming at anyone who knew how to read them. That evening, I went home to my apartment on the north side of Columbus and tried to shake off the weird feeling that had been growing all day. I lived alone in a one-bedroom place about 15 minutes from the warehouse. My parents lived down in Phoenix, and my younger sister Teresa was teaching 3rd grade in Cleveland. We talked every Sunday, and I was supposed to drive up to see her that weekend. I remember making dinner and turning on the evening news while I ate. The lead story was about increased seismic activity around Yellowstone, but they presented it like a curiosity rather than a threat. The reporter interviewed some geologists who said the park sits on top of an active volcano, but eruptions happen on geological timescales, meaning thousands or tens of thousands of years between events. The last major eruption was over 600,000 years ago. What they didn't mention, what I learned later, was that the seismic activity had been increasing exponentially over the past month. Small earthquakes were happening every few hours instead of every few days. Ground temperatures in some areas of the park had risen by several degrees. These weren't normal fluctuations. I went to bed that night with an uneasy feeling I couldn't shake. You know that sensation when you're sure you've forgotten something important, but you can't figure out what it is. That's how I felt like there was some crucial detail right at the edge of my awareness that I wasn't quite grasping. I woke up at 4:30 the next morning, Tuesday, September 15th, to my usual alarm. The routine was always the same. Shower, coffee, check weather and traffic reports, drive to the warehouse, review overnight deliveries, plan the day's routes. It was a Tuesday like hundreds of other Tuesdays, except it was the last normal day any of us would ever have. The weather report called for partly cloudy skies and a high of 68 degrees. Perfect September weather in Ohio. I remember thinking it would be a good day for our drivers. Clear roads and comfortable temperatures. I had no idea that by noon, none of that would matter anymore. I arrived at the warehouse just after 5:30 and found Carlos already there, which was unusual. He typically didn't come in until 6. He was standing in the parking lot, talking on his phone in rapid Spanish, gesturing with his free hand in a way that told me he was agitated about something. When he hung up, I asked what was going on. He told me his brother lived in Bozeman, Montana, and had called to say there were evacuation orders going out for areas around Yellowstone. Not partial evacuations or tourist restrictions, but mandatory evacuations for entire towns. The National Guard was setting up roadblocks and checkpoints. That should have been the moment I realized what was coming. But instead, I went into problem-solving mode. I started thinking about how evacuation orders might affect our delivery routes, whether we needed to reroute any of our drivers around areas that might have road closures. I was still thinking in terms of business disruptions, not civilization. Ending events. We went inside and started reviewing the morning manifests. 23 trucks scheduled to roll out between 6 and 8 o'clock, carrying everything from fresh produce for grocery stores to frozen foods for restaurants to canned goods for food banks. It was a typical Tuesday morning load, representing thousands of meals for families across 3 states. At 6:15, while I was double-checking the inventory sheets for truck number 17, my phone started buzzing with emergency alerts. The first one made my stomach drop. Geological emergency, Yellowstone National Park. Seek shelter immediately. I looked up at Carlos, who was staring at his own phone with his mouth open. Then every phone in the warehouse started going off. At once, emergency alerts, news notifications, phone calls. The drivers who had already arrived were pulling out their phones and talking in worried voices. I turned on the radio we kept in the office, and every station was carrying the same emergency broadcast. At 6:11 that morning, the Yellowstone caldera had erupted with an explosion that registered as a magnitude 7 earthquake. The blast had sent a column of ash and debris 15 miles into the atmosphere. Winds were carrying the ash cloud east across the country. But even then, even hearing those words, I didn't fully understand what they meant. I was still thinking about this as a regional disaster, maybe something that would affect our Montana and Wyoming routes but wouldn't reach us in Ohio. The reporter was talking about flight delays and air quality warnings, not the end of civilization. Carlos grabbed my arm and pointed at the small television we had mounted in the corner of the office. The morning news was showing aerial footage of the eruption, and it looked like something out of a science fiction movie. A massive gray and black cloud was rising from what used to be Yellowstone National Park, spreading out like an umbrella as it reached the upper atmosphere. The reporter was interviewing a volcanologist via phone who was trying to explain the scale of what was happening. He said this was a supervolcanic eruption, something that occurs maybe once every 100,000 years. The ash cloud would block sunlight across most of North America. Temperatures would drop rapidly, crops would fail. The power grid would be stressed beyond capacity. I remember standing there in my office, watching this footage, and feeling like I was dreaming. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen in the modern world. We had technology, infrastructure, government agencies that prepared for disasters. Surely someone had plans for this. By 7 o'clock, I had to make the first of many impossible decisions that would define the next 90 days of my life. Half my drivers had arrived and were asking whether they should proceed with their routes. The other half were calling to say they wanted to go home to their families. The phones were ringing constantly with store managers asking about deliveries. I looked at the weather radar on my computer, and the ash cloud was already covering Montana, Wyoming, and the western edges of North Dakota and South Dakota. It was moving east at about 30 miles per hour, which meant it would reach us in Ohio by late afternoon or early evening. I made the call to suspend all deliveries and send everyone home to their families. Looking back, that decision probably saved lives. My drivers who would have been on the road when the ash cloud hit might not have made it back. But it also meant that dozens of stores, restaurants, and food banks wouldn't get their scheduled deliveries right before the biggest crisis in human history. By 8 o'clock, the parking lot was empty except for my car and Carlos's truck. We stood in the warehouse surrounded by thousands of cases of canned goods, frozen foods, and dry goods that were supposed to be distributed across 3 states. The radio was reporting panic buying at grocery stores, traffic jams of people trying to evacuate cities, and government officials urging everyone to remain calm. Carlos asked if we should lock everything up and go home. It was a reasonable question. The smart thing would have been to secure the building and get back to our families while the roads were still passable. But something inside me rebelled against that idea. I thought about all the people who depended on the food we distributed. The elderly folks who shopped at the grocery stores on our routes. The families who relied on food banks to put meals on the table. The restaurant workers who would lose their jobs if their employers couldn't stay open. If the situation was as bad as the experts were saying, those people were going to need food more than ever. I told Carlos he should go home to his wife and kids, and I meant it. He had a family to protect, and I wouldn't have blamed him for choosing them over a warehouse full of food. But he looked at me with this expression I'll never forget and said his family would be safer in a world where people like us didn't abandon our responsibilities when things got hard. We decided to stay and see what developed. Neither of us really understood what we were committing to, but it felt like the right thing to do. We locked the main gates but left the building accessible in case people needed help. We inventoried our emergency supplies: flashlights, batteries, first aid kits, some basic tools. The warehouse had backup generators and a decent heating system. If we had to ride out a few days of disruption, we could manage. By 10 o'clock that morning, the first desperate people started showing up at our gates. A woman with 2 young children said the grocery stores were already sold out of everything. An elderly man asked if we had any medicine for his diabetic wife. A family from West Virginia was driving north and had heard on the radio that there was a food distribution center in Columbus. I found myself making decisions I'd never trained for. Do we give away inventory that doesn't belong to us? How do we decide who gets help and who doesn't? What happens when more people show up than we can feed? Carlos and I developed a system. We would provide basic food supplies to anyone who needed them, but only what they required for immediate survival. No hoarding, no reselling, no taking advantage of the crisis. We started keeping a log of who we helped and what we gave them. Partly for accountability and partly because it felt important to document what was happening. The radio reports were getting more alarming by the hour. The ash cloud was larger than anyone had predicted. It was blocking sunlight across the entire western United States. Temperatures were dropping faster than the weather models had projected. Power plants were shutting down because ash was clogging their air intakes. By noon, the sky outside was starting to look strange. Still blue, but with this hazy quality that made the sun appear dimmer than usual. The temperature, which should have been climbing toward the predicted high of 68 degrees, had stalled out at about 55. That afternoon, we had our first real test of the system Carlos and I had created. A group of about 20 people arrived in several cars, led by a man who introduced himself as a community organizer from the south side of Columbus. He said they represented families from their neighborhood who had pooled their money to buy food in bulk. The problem was, they wanted to purchase enough food to last their entire group for several months. Even at wholesale prices, they were talking about tens of thousands of dollars worth of inventory. I didn't have the authority to make that kind of sale, and even if I did, it would have depleted our supplies for everyone else who might need help. I tried to explain our policy about providing immediate assistance without hoarding, but the community organizer became increasingly aggressive. He pointed out that his people had money and were offering to pay, unlike the individuals we'd been helping for free. He said it wasn't fair to deny them food they could afford just to save it for people who couldn't pay. It was the first time I realized that managing a crisis wasn't just about logistics and resources. It was about navigating competing moral claims and making decisions that would affect real people's lives. Do you help 20 families who can pay, or do you save food for 200 families who might not be able to? I stuck with our policy, and the group left angry. I knew they'd probably find food somewhere else, but I also knew that somewhere else might be other people who wouldn't get fed. Every choice created ripple effects that I couldn't fully predict or control. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the western edge of the ash cloud was visible on the horizon. It looked like a massive thunderstorm approaching, Except it was moving with unnatural uniformity, and the color was wrong. Instead of the dark gray of normal storm clouds, this was lighter, almost brownish, like dust suspended in the air. The radio reported that the cloud was already over Illinois and moving into Indiana. Temperatures in Chicago had dropped to 40 degrees and were still falling. The airports were shutting down because volcanic ash could damage jet engines. The interstate highways were clogged with people trying to evacuate eastward, but there was nowhere to go that the ash wouldn't reach. That's when I started to understand that this wasn't a temporary disruption. This was a fundamental change to the world we lived in. The ash wasn't going to blow away in a few days. The temperatures weren't going to bounce back to normal once. The cloud passed. We were looking at months or maybe years of darkness and cold. Carlos and I made the decision to prepare for an extended crisis. We moved the most essential supplies to the heated areas of the warehouse. We tested the backup generators and calculated how long our fuel would last. We identified the most defensible areas of the building in case we had to deal with more aggressive groups than the community organizer. By 6 o'clock, the ash cloud was overhead. The sun disappeared behind a gray haze that made everything look like it was lit by fluorescent bulbs. The temperature had dropped to 45 degrees and showed no signs of stopping. We could see ash starting to fall like snow, coating the cars in the parking lot with a fine layer of gray dust. The first family arrived asking for shelter around 7 o'clock that evening. A young couple with a 6-month-old baby, driving an old sedan with Arkansas's license plates. They'd been trying to reach family in Pennsylvania when their car started overheating from ash clogging the air filter. They had no money, no supplies, and a baby who needed formula and diapers. I looked at Carlos, and we both knew we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. We weren't just distributing food anymore. We were taking responsibility for keeping people alive. The warehouse was about to become not just a supply depot, but a shelter, a community, and maybe the difference between life and death for anyone who found their way to our doors. As I helped the young family bring their belongings inside and set up a sleeping area in one of the heated sections of the warehouse, I realized I was no longer just Joaquin Restrepo, Regional Distribution Manager for Midwest Fresh Foods. I was becoming something I'd never planned to be, the person responsible for keeping a group of strangers alive through what might be the end of the world as we knew it. The temperature outside hit 32 degrees at 9 o'clock that evening. In 12 hours, we'd gone from pleasant September weather to freezing. The ash was falling steadily now, accumulating like snow but with a gritty texture that got into everything. The radio stations were starting to go off the air as power grids failed and broadcasting equipment was damaged by the ash. Carlos and I did a final inventory before settling in for what we knew would be a very long night. We had enough food to keep maybe 50 people fed for several months if we were careful about rationing. The heating system was working, but we had no idea how long the natural gas supply would continue functioning. The building was secure, but it wasn't designed as a fortress. As I settled down to try to get some sleep in the office I'd converted into a bedroom, I could hear the young family talking quietly in the next room, trying to comfort their crying baby. Outside, the ash continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear other people moving around in the darkness, probably looking for shelter or supplies. I thought about my parents in Phoenix and my sister in Cleveland. I wondered if they were safe, if they had found shelter, if I would ever see them again. The phone networks had started failing that afternoon as cell towers lost power and landlines were damaged by the ashfall. That's when I realized the government lied. All those assurances about temporary disruptions and routine disaster preparedness had been wishful thinking or deliberate misdirection. This wasn't something that would be fixed in days or weeks. This was permanent. The world we'd known was over, and the world we were entering was going to test every assumption we'd ever made about civilization, community, and survival. The morning of day 8 was when I truly understood we weren't dealing with a temporary crisis anymore. I woke up in what used to be my office to complete silence. Not the comfortable quiet of early morning, but the dead silence that comes when an entire world has stopped functioning. The sun should have been rising, but when I looked outside, I couldn't tell if it was 6 in the morning or 6 in the evening. The ash cloud had turned day and night into the same gray twilight. The thermometer outside the loading dock read 8 degrees below zero, and it was still dropping. Carlos was already awake, standing by the main entrance with Maria Santos, my driver who had gotten stranded here when her truck broke down on day 3. They were looking out at what used to be Industrial Boulevard, but now it was just a white wasteland of ash drifts and abandoned vehicles. The power had gone out completely sometime during the night. Our backup generators were running, but I knew we only had fuel for maybe 2 weeks if we were conservative about usage. The heating system was gas-powered, which was still working, but every day I expected to wake up and find that the gas pressure had dropped too low to keep us warm. By day 8, we had 14 people sheltering in the warehouse. The young family from Arkansas with their baby, an elderly couple whose apartment building had lost heat, 2 college students who had been driving home when their car got stuck in an ash drift, a single mother with 3 children who had been evicted from her apartment 2 days before the eruption and was living in her car when the world ended. Each person who arrived forced me to make calculations I'd never imagined I'd need to make. How much food could we spare? How much heating fuel would an additional person consume? How much space did we have left in the areas of the building that stayed warm? Whether this new person would contribute to our community or just consume our resources. But the hardest part wasn't the math. It was looking into the faces of desperate people and having to sometimes say we couldn't help them. We'd already turned away 3 groups because we simply didn't have the capacity. A family of 6 from Michigan whose car had broken down. An elderly man with diabetes who needed medication we didn't have. A group of teenagers who seemed more interested in what they could take than what they could contribute. Every time I had to turn someone away, I wondered if I was signing their death warrant. But every time I accepted someone new, I wondered if I was condemning everyone already here to a slower death by starvation or cold. Carlos had become my unofficial second in command, and Maria had turned out to have mechanical skills that were keeping our generators running. But it was clear that our little group needed more structure if we were going to survive what was starting to look like a very long crisis. I called everyone together that morning in the main area we'd converted into a communal living space. It was the section of the warehouse that stayed warmest and had the best access to our food supplies and water. We'd arranged salvaged furniture into a rough circle and strung extension cords so people could charge their phones when the generators were running. I told them what I'd figured out during my sleepless night. Based on our current consumption, we had enough food for maybe 2 months if we rationed carefully. Our heating fuel would last longer, but only if we limited our heated space to essential areas. Water was going to become a problem soon because the pipes were starting to freeze, and melting ash snow was possible but required fuel we might need for other things. But the real problem was that we were essentially under siege, not by an army, but by the weather itself. The ash was continuing to fall, which meant the roads were becoming impassable. Even if we wanted to leave, even if we knew somewhere better to go, we might not be able to get there. Sarah, the single mother with 3 kids, asked the question I'd been dreading. What happened when our food ran out? I told her the truth, which was that we'd need to find more or we'd starve. But finding more meant venturing out into a landscape that was becoming more dangerous every day. That's when I explained the system I'd developed based on my 12 years of managing supply chains and people. We were going to operate like a small business, except instead of profit, our goal was survival. Everyone would have a job. Everyone would contribute according to their abilities. Resources would be distributed based on need, but waste wouldn't be tolerated. Carlos would handle security and maintenance. Maria would manage our vehicles and generators. Sarah, who had worked as a nurse before losing her job, would be our medical officer. The college students would handle inventory and rationing. The elderly couple would help with food preparation and child care. I would coordinate everything and make the final decisions when we couldn't reach consensus. It wasn't a perfect system, and it definitely wasn't democratic, but democracy is a luxury you can afford when everyone has enough food and warmth. When people are dying, someone needs to be in charge. The real test of our system came on day 10 when we had our first major crisis. The heating system started making strange noises, and the temperature in our living area began dropping rapidly. Within a few hours, it had gone from a comfortable 68 degrees to barely above freezing. Maria diagnosed the problem. Ash had clogged the air intake for the furnace, and the system was shutting down to prevent damage. But cleaning the intake meant going outside in sub-zero temperatures and ash that was still falling. It also meant shutting down the heat completely for at least an hour while we worked. This was the moment I learned that leadership during a crisis isn't about making popular decisions. It's about making necessary decisions and then living with the consequences. We had to fix the heating system or we'd all freeze to death. But the repair work would be dangerous, and if something went wrong, we might lose our heat permanently. I volunteered to go out with Maria to clean the intake. Carlos wanted to come too, but I needed him inside to manage the group and restart the system if we ran into trouble. We bundled up in every piece of clothing we could find, covered our faces with cloth to filter the ash, and headed out into what used to be the parking lot. The landscape outside was like nothing I'd ever seen. The ash had drifted against buildings and cars like snow, but it was gritty and got into everything. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, and the falling ash made it hard to see more than a few feet in any direction. This was what nuclear winter must look like, except it wasn't nuclear weapons that caused it, just a volcano that happened to wake up after 600,000 years. Working outside in those conditions was brutal. The ash got into our eyes, our mouths, our clothes. The cold made our fingers clumsy and our tools hard to handle. But we managed to clear the intake and get back inside before hypothermia set in. When we restarted the heating system, it worked perfectly. The temperature in our living area started climbing back toward comfortable levels. But the experience taught me something important about what we were facing. This wasn't like a winter storm that you wait out for a few days. This was a fundamental change to the environment that we'd have to adapt to or die. That night, while everyone else was sleeping, I did the calculations that had been keeping me awake for days, based on what we were seeing. On the radio before the stations went dark, this ash cloud covered most of North America. Weather reports from other countries suggested it was spreading globally. Temperatures were dropping everywhere. This meant agriculture would be impossible for the foreseeable future. No sunlight meant no crops. No crops meant no food production. No food production meant that within a few months, the existing food supplies would be exhausted. After that, people would starve unless they found other sources of nutrition. But it also meant that every can of food, every bag of rice, every box of crackers we had in our warehouse was now incredibly valuable. Not just to us, but to anyone who was still alive and trying to survive. Eventually, people would figure out that places like our warehouse existed, and they'd come looking for what we had. Some of those people would be families like the ones we'd already helped, desperate folks who just needed enough food to keep their children alive. But others would be more dangerous. People who had decided that in a world without law enforcement or government services, the strong take from the weak. I started planning for that possibility. Our warehouse was big and mostly open, which made it hard to defend but easy to escape from. The loading docks could be barricaded, but they could also be breached if someone was determined enough. We had a few tools that could serve as weapons, but nothing that would stop a well-organized group. More importantly, I started thinking about escape routes. If our warehouse became untenable, where could we go that might be safer? What other locations might have food supplies and better security? How we could move 14 people, including small children and elderly folks, through a landscape that was becoming more hostile every day. Day 12 brought our first contact with other survivors outside our immediate group. A woman named Rebecca showed up at our loading dock entrance, alone and on foot. She was maybe 40 years old, wearing a heavy coat over what looked like business clothes, carrying a backpack that seemed to contain everything she owned. Rebecca told us she'd been working as an accountant in downtown Columbus when the eruption happened. She'd tried to stay in her apartment for the first week, but the building lost power and heat, and she'd run out of food. She'd walked 12 miles through the ash drifts to reach us, following rumors that there was a group providing food somewhere on Industrial Boulevard. What Rebecca told us about conditions in the city was terrifying. Most buildings had lost power by day 5. The water system had failed by day 8 because the pumping stations couldn't function with ash clogging their intakes. Grocery stores had been looted completely within the first 72 hours. But worse than the infrastructure failures was what was happening to people. Rebecca said she'd seen families fighting over cans of food. Groups of men were going building to building, taking whatever supplies they could find from people who were too weak or too few to resist. Dead bodies were becoming common, both from exposure and from violence. The police had tried to maintain order for the first few days, but their communications were down and many officers had abandoned their posts to take care of their own families. By the time Rebecca left downtown, there was no organized law enforcement left. It was every person for themselves. This was exactly what I'd been worried about. As conditions deteriorated, people would become more desperate and more willing to take what they needed from others. Our warehouse, with its obvious abundance of food and warm shelter, would become a target for anyone who knew we existed. I made the decision to limit our contact with outsiders. We would still help people who showed up genuinely needing assistance, like Rebecca, but we wouldn't advertise our presence or our resources. No more radio communications that might be intercepted. No more lights visible from outside at night. No more unnecessary trips beyond our immediate perimeter. Rebecca proved to be a valuable addition to our group. Her accounting skills were perfect for managing our increasingly complex rationing system, and she had a calm personality that helped mediate disputes between other group members. But her stories about downtown Columbus made everyone understand how precarious our situation really was. Day 15 brought the first real test of our security measures. A group of 5 men showed up at our loading dock, claiming they were from the National Guard and conducting welfare checks on survivor communities. They wanted to inspect our facilities and inventory our supplies for coordination with other relief efforts. Everything about them felt wrong. Their uniforms looked authentic, but they didn't match each other perfectly. They had no vehicle, which seemed unlikely for an actual military unit. Most importantly, their leader kept asking specific questions about our food supplies and how many people we had, questions that seemed more like intelligence gathering than welfare checking. I told them we were doing fine and didn't need assistance, but they insisted on coming inside to verify our conditions. When I refused, their leader became aggressive, saying they had authority to inspect any facility that might be hoarding resources needed for community survival. Carlos appeared at my shoulder, along with Maria and 2 of the college students. We weren't armed with anything more dangerous than tire irons and crowbars, but we outnumbered the fake guardsmen and we knew the layout of our building better than they did. After a tense few minutes, they decided to move on to check other locations. But I knew they'd be back, probably with more people and a better plan. That night, I called another group meeting to discuss our security situation. We couldn't fight off a determined assault, but we could make ourselves a harder target than other potential sources of supplies. We developed a system of watches, with at least 2 people awake and monitoring the entrances at all times. We identified hiding places within the warehouse where people could go if we were attacked. We planned escape routes that would allow us to evacuate quickly if the building became indefensible. Most importantly, we started discussing the possibility that we might need to abandon the warehouse entirely. As much as I hated the idea of giving up our secure shelter and abundant supplies, I was beginning to think that staying in such an obvious target might be more dangerous than trying to find somewhere more defensible. The weather was getting worse every day. By day 18, the temperature outside had stabilized at around 20 degrees below zero during the day and 40 below at night. The ash was still falling, not as heavily as during the first week, but enough to keep accumulating. Some of the drifts against our building were now higher than the loading dock doors. But the cold was also preserving food that would normally spoil, which meant we were finding frozen supplies in abandoned vehicles and buildings. Maria had become expert at salvaging useful materials from the cars buried in our parking lot. Solar panels that still worked when cleaned of ash, batteries that held charge in the cold, tools and spare parts that might be essential later. Day 20 brought news that changed everything we thought we knew about our situation. Rebecca had been monitoring radio frequencies with a battery-powered shortwave radio, and she picked up a transmission from what claimed to be the emergency broadcast system. The message was brief and repeated every hour. Large portions of the United States were under martial law. FEMA had established refugee camps in major cities that still had infrastructure. Transportation was being organized to move survivors from rural areas to these camps where they could receive food, medical care, and shelter. But the message also included warnings that unauthorized hoarding of food supplies was illegal under emergency regulations. Communities or individuals found to be stockpiling resources would have those resources confiscated for redistribution. Anyone who interfered with relief operations would be subject to arrest. I realized that our warehouse full of food probably qualified as unauthorized hoarding under these new regulations. If legitimate government forces found us, they might confiscate our supplies and force us to relocate to one of the refugee camps. If illegitimate forces found us claiming to represent the government, they might take our supplies and leave us to freeze. Either way, staying in such an obvious location was becoming more dangerous every day. But relocating 14 people, including children and elderly folks, through a landscape of sub-zero temperatures and ash drifts would be incredibly risky. We needed a destination that offered better security and sustainability than our current location. That's when I started thinking about my knowledge of the regional supply chain. In 12 years of distribution work, I'd learned about every warehouse, processing facility, and storage depot within 300 miles of Columbus. Most importantly, I knew about facilities that were designed to be secure and had independent power and heating systems. There was a regional food processing plant about 40 miles northeast of Columbus that might be perfect for our needs. It was smaller than our warehouse but built like a fortress because it handled government contracts for military meals. It had its own power generation, water treatment, and security systems. Most importantly, it was far enough from any major city that it might not have been discovered by other survivor groups. But getting there would require vehicles that could handle ash drifts and sub-zero temperatures. We'd need fuel for the trip and for heating once we arrived. We'd need to move not just our people, but enough supplies to sustain us until we could establish ourselves at the new location. Day 22 brought the crisis that forced my hand about leaving the warehouse. We woke up to find that someone had been testing our perimeter defenses during the night. Footprints in the ash around the building. Tool marks on the loading dock doors where someone had tried to pry them open. Most concerning, evidence that our fuel storage area had been examined closely. Carlos found the tracks and followed them to a position about 200 yards away where several people had been watching our building. They'd constructed a shelter from salvaged materials and had been there for at least 2 days based on the accumulated supplies and waste. This meant we were under active surveillance by people who were planning something more than a casual visit. They were studying our routines, our security measures, our weaknesses. They were preparing for an operation that would probably happen. Soon, I made the decision that we had to leave within 48 hours. Waiting any longer meant risking a confrontation we probably couldn't win, and that would cost lives I was responsible for protecting. We'd take what we could carry and abandon what we couldn't, but we'd do it on our terms rather than waiting to be forced out. The next day and a half were a frenzy of preparation. We identified the vehicles in our parking lot that were most likely to run after being buried in ash for 3 weeks. Carlos and Maria worked on getting 2 pickup trucks and a delivery van operational. We loaded them with food, water, fuel, medical supplies, tools, and warm clothing. The hardest part was deciding what to leave behind. Thousands of cans of food that could keep us fed for months. Comfortable furniture that made the warehouse feel like home. Personal belongings that people had brought with them when they joined our group. Everything that wouldn't fit in 3 vehicles had to stay. But as difficult as those choices were, I knew we were making the right decision. The warehouse had served its purpose as a shelter during the initial crisis, but it was becoming a liability rather than an asset. We needed somewhere more defensible and less obvious if we were going to survive the months ahead. On the morning we were scheduled to leave, Rebecca spotted movement near our surveillance position. At least 6 people were moving toward the warehouse, carrying what looked like weapons. They seemed to be positioning themselves for an assault on the building. We were out of time. I gave the signal to load up and move out immediately. Carlos started the lead truck while Maria got the van running. Everyone else piled into the vehicles with whatever they could grab at the last minute. As we pulled out of the warehouse parking lot for the last time, I could see figures running toward the building we'd just abandoned. They'd probably find it empty except for the supplies we couldn't take, but they'd also find evidence of how we'd lived and where we might be going. Driving through the ash-covered landscape was like navigating an alien planet. Roads were barely visible under drifts that were sometimes deeper than our vehicles. Abandoned cars and trucks created obstacles we had to navigate around. The falling ash made visibility so poor that we could barely see 50 feet ahead. But we made progress, slowly and carefully, toward the processing plant that represented our best hope for long-term survival. Behind us, smoke was rising from the direction of our warehouse. Someone had set it on fire, probably to destroy evidence of their raid or maybe just out of spite. I thought about all the food that was burning, food that could have kept people alive through the coming months. I thought about the comfortable shelter we'd created and were now abandoning. I thought about the community we'd built among 14 strangers who'd learned to trust each other and work together. But mostly I thought about the decision I'd made on day 8 to turn our warehouse into more than just a place to hide. We'd created something that mattered, a place where people took care of each other and worked together for everyone's survival. Now we had to do it again somewhere else, and we had to do it before the people following us figured out where we'd gone. As we reached the city limits and headed into the rural areas that might offer better concealment, I realized we weren't just fleeing from immediate danger. We were beginning a journey that would test everything we'd learned about survival, community, and leadership in the new world that was emerging from the ashes of the old one. The radio had gone completely silent, which meant we were now cut off from any information about the outside world. We were on our own 14 people in 3 vehicles, carrying everything we owned toward an uncertain destination in a landscape that was becoming more hostile. Every day, the drive to the processing plant took us 6 hours to cover what should have been a 40-mile trip. The roads were buried under ash drifts that made navigation nearly impossible, and we had to backtrack 3 times when we encountered obstacles that our vehicles couldn't handle. But the real challenge wasn't the terrain. It was the growing realization that we weren't the only ones moving through this frozen wasteland. About halfway to our destination, Carlos spotted vehicle tracks in the ash that were too fresh to be from before the eruption. Someone else was using these roads, and based on the tire patterns, it looked like a convoy of at least 4 vehicles. Heavy trucks that could handle the conditions better than our improvised fleet. I made the decision to follow the tracks for a few miles to see where they led, and what we found made my blood run cold. The convoy had stopped at a farmhouse about 2 miles off the main road. The building was still smoking, and there were clear signs of violence. Broken windows, bullet holes in the walls, personal belongings scattered in the yard. We didn't stop to investigate, but the message was clear. There were organized groups moving through the area, and they weren't interested in helping other survivors. They were taking what they wanted and eliminating anyone who might resist or report their activities. This changed everything about our security situation. We weren't just hiding from desperate individuals or small groups of opportunists. We were potentially dealing with people who had vehicles, weapons, and the willingness to use violence to get what they needed. Our little community of 14 people wouldn't stand a chance in a direct confrontation. When we finally reached the processing plant on day 26, I was relieved to find it exactly as I remembered. A solid concrete building surrounded by a chain-link fence designed to handle large-scale food processing for government contracts. The facility was built like a fortress because it had to meet federal security standards for military supply operations. But getting inside presented our first major challenge. The gates were locked with heavy chains and industrial padlocks. The building itself was sealed tight with no obvious way to enter without breaking something. Carlos and Maria spent 2 hours checking the perimeter before finding a maintenance entrance that we could access without causing visible damage. The interior of the plant was exactly what we needed. Large processing areas that could be converted into living spaces. Industrial kitchens with gas-powered equipment. A backup power system that included both generators and solar panels. Most importantly, a security office with monitors connected to cameras that covered the entire perimeter. But the best discovery was the cold storage area. The plant's refrigeration system was still running on backup power, and the storage rooms contained hundreds of cases of military meals ready to eat. Freeze-dried foods with shelf lives measured in decades. Enough nutrition to keep our group fed for years if we were careful. About rationing. Setting up our new community in the processing plant took 3 days of intense work. We had to figure out which areas could be heated efficiently with our limited fuel supplies. We had to test all the equipment to make sure it was still functional after weeks without maintenance. We had to establish security protocols that would keep us safe without making the facility look obviously occupied. The most important task was establishing communication with the outside world. Rebecca managed to get the plant's radio equipment working, and what we heard over the next few days painted a terrifying picture of how quickly civilization was collapsing. Government broadcasts were becoming increasingly desperate and contradictory. FEMA camps were reportedly overcrowded and running out of supplies. Martial law had been declared in most major cities, but law enforcement was breaking down as officers abandoned their posts to protect their families. International aid was being offered by other countries, but transportation networks were too damaged to deliver assistance effectively. More disturbing were the unofficial transmissions we intercepted. Radio chatter between groups that were clearly not government agencies. Coordination of raids on survivor communities. Reports of massacres at refugee camps where resources had run out. Negotiations between different factions about territory and resource-sharing agreements. It was becoming clear that the United States, as we knew it, was ceasing to exist. Federal authority was collapsing under the weight of a crisis too large for any government to handle. State and local governments were either defunct or focused entirely on protecting their immediate areas. What was emerging was a patchwork of small communities, armed groups, and lawless zones where survival depended entirely on local resources and defensive capabilities. Our processing plant was well positioned to survive this new reality, but only if we could avoid attracting the wrong kind of attention. The facility was remote enough to avoid casual discovery, but visible enough from the air that organized groups with aircraft could find us if they were looking systematically. That's why what happened on day 32 was so concerning. Rebecca picked up radio transmissions that mentioned a food processing facility northeast of Columbus that might be worth investigating. The transmissions were between two groups that were clearly coordinating their activities, and they were planning to check every industrial facility within a 100-mile radius of major cities. I realized we had maybe 2 weeks before organized search parties reached our area. After that, our location would be compromised and we'd face the same threats that had forced us to abandon the warehouse. But this time, we didn't have an obvious alternative destination. The moral dilemmas we faced at the processing plant were even more complex than what we dealt with at the warehouse. Every few days, survivors would appear at our gates asking for help. Families with children who were starving and freezing. Elderly people who couldn't survive on their own. Injured folks who needed medical attention we could provide. But helping them meant sharing resources we might need for our own survival. It also meant potentially compromising our security by increasing the number of people who knew about our location. Every person we helped was someone who might be captured and forced to reveal information about our defenses and supplies. The hardest case was a family of 5 who arrived on day 35. Parents with 3 children under 10 years old, driving a car that was barely functional and carrying almost no supplies. They'd been on the road for 2 weeks, sleeping in their vehicle and eating whatever they could scavenge from abandoned buildings. The children were showing signs of malnutrition and hypothermia. The youngest, a girl who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, was barely conscious when they arrived. Without immediate help, she probably wouldn't survive another night in those conditions. But accepting 5 new people would strain our resources significantly. Our food supplies would last months less. Our heating fuel would be consumed much faster. Our living space would become crowded and potentially less secure. Most importantly, we had no idea whether these people would integrate well into our community or create problems that might threaten everyone's survival. I made the decision to help them, but with conditions. They would be on probation for 2 weeks, while we evaluated their contribution to the group and their commitment to our security protocols. If they worked out, they'd become full members of our community. If they didn't, they'd have to leave with enough supplies to reach another destination. It was a harsh system, but these were harsh times. I couldn't afford to let sentiment override practical considerations when the wrong decision could get everyone killed. Leadership during a crisis means making choices that let you sleep at night while keeping the people who depend on you alive. To see morning. The family proved to be valuable additions to our group. The father had construction experience that helped us improve our defenses and heating efficiency. The mother was a former teacher who organized educational activities for all the children in our community. Even the kids contributed by taking on age-appropriate tasks that freed adults for more complex work. But their arrival also marked the beginning of a new phase in our community's development. We were no longer just a survival group focused on basic needs. We were becoming something that resembled a small town, with social structures, shared responsibilities, and long-term planning that extended beyond immediate crisis management. This transition created new challenges that I hadn't anticipated. People started forming relationships and alliances within the group, that sometimes conflicted with practical decision-making. Resources that seemed abundant when we were focused on short-term survival began to look finite when we started thinking about years rather than months. Most significantly, our radio monitoring revealed that we weren't the only community trying to build something sustainable from the ruins of the old world. There were other groups out there, some cooperative and some predatory, and eventually we'd have to decide how to interact with them. Day 40 brought our first direct contact with another organized survivor community. A woman named Jennifer approached our perimeter alone, carrying a white flag made from a torn bedsheet. She said she represented a group of about 30 people who had established themselves in a school building about 15 miles south of our location. Jennifer's group wanted to propose a mutual assistance agreement. They had medical supplies and personnel that we might need, including a doctor and a nurse. We had food processing equipment and storage capacity that they lacked. She suggested that our communities could trade resources and coordinate security against the hostile groups that were increasingly active in our region. The proposal made sense from a practical standpoint, but it also represented a major shift in our situation. We'd been operating as an isolated community that could make decisions quickly and change direction when necessary. Allying with another group would mean compromising some of our independence in exchange for additional security and resources. I told Jennifer we'd consider her proposal, but I needed to verify that her group was actually what she claimed it was. Carlos and Maria volunteered to visit the school building and assess whether these potential allies were trustworthy or represented a more sophisticated threat to our security. What they found was encouraging. Jennifer's group had indeed established a functional community in a defensible location. They had medical capabilities we lacked, mechanical expertise that could help maintain our equipment, and most importantly, a radio network that connected them to several other survivor communities across the region. But Carlos also reported something that concerned me. Jennifer's group was much more militarized than ours. They had organized patrols, weapons training, and defensive positions that suggested they'd already faced serious threats. Their community looked more like a military base than a civilian shelter. When Carlos asked about their security situation, he learned that they'd been attacked twice by organized raiding parties. Both attacks had been repelled, but at significant cost in ammunition and medical supplies. They were actively recruiting other communities into a defensive alliance because they expected larger and more coordinated attacks in the future. Information forced me to confront a reality I'd been trying to avoid. The groups that had driven us from the warehouse and burned the farmhouse we'd discovered weren't isolated incidents. There was a pattern of organized violence emerging across the region, and communities like ours were becoming primary targets. I called a meeting of our entire group to discuss Jennifer's proposal and what Carlos had learned about the broader security situation. For the first time since we'd come together, we faced a decision that would fundamentally change what kind of community we were and how we related to the world beyond our walls. Sarah, our nurse and the mother of 3 children, argued strongly for accepting the alliance. She pointed out that we had children and elderly people who needed medical care we couldn't provide. If someone got seriously injured or sick, alliance with Jennifer's group might mean the difference between life and death. Rebecca, our accountant, was more skeptical. She worried that allying with a militarized community would make us a target for the same groups that had attacked them. She also pointed out that mutual assistance agreements could become mutual dependency relationships that limited our freedom to make independent decisions. The college students wanted to know more about the radio network Jennifer had mentioned. If there were multiple survivor communities coordinating their activities, that suggested possibilities for trade, information sharing, and maybe even reconstruction of some kind of broader social order. Carlos and Maria supported the alliance. From a security perspective, They'd seen enough evidence of organized threats to believe that we couldn't defend ourselves indefinitely as an isolated community. Better to join a defensive alliance while we still had valuable resources to contribute than to wait until we were desperate and had little to offer. I found myself torn between competing priorities that all seemed essential to our survival. We needed the medical capabilities and security cooperation that the alliance offered. But we also needed to maintain the independence and flexibility that had kept us alive so far. The deciding factor was something Carlos mentioned during his reconnaissance of Jennifer's community. Their radio network had picked up intelligence about a large, well-organized group that was systematically conquering or destroying survivor communities across central Ohio. This group had vehicles, heavy weapons, and the organizational structure of a military unit. According to the radio reports, this group operated by offering communities a choice: join their organization as subordinate units, providing food and labor in exchange for protection, or be destroyed and have their resources taken by force. Communities that chose to resist were eliminated completely, with no survivors left to warn others. The group was moving methodically from south to north, absorbing or destroying every organized community they encountered. Based on their current location and rate of progress, they'd reach our area within 2 to 3 weeks. This changed the entire strategic situation. We weren't just deciding whether to form a trade alliance with friendly neighbors. We were deciding whether to join a defensive confederation against an existential threat to every survivor community in the region. I made the decision to accept Jennifer's alliance proposal, but with specific conditions that would protect our community's core interests. We would coordinate security and share intelligence about threats. We would trade resources when both communities benefited from the exchange. But we would maintain our independence and the right to make our own decisions about internal community matters. The alliance was formalized on day 43 with a ceremony that felt like signing a peace treaty between small nations. Representatives from both communities met at a neutral location halfway between our facilities. We exchanged detailed maps of our areas, radio frequencies for secure communication, and preliminary agreements about resource sharing and mutual assistance. But even as we were establishing this cooperation, our radio monitoring was picking up increasingly urgent transmissions about the military group that was approaching our region. They'd absorbed 2 more survivor communities in the past week, adding their resources and personnel to an organization that was becoming more powerful with every conquest. The transmissions described a group with military discipline, heavy weapons, and a clear strategy for controlling territory and resources. They weren't just raiders taking what they needed and moving on. They were building an empire from the ruins of Ohio, and they expected everyone in their path to submit or be eliminated. Jennifer's radio network included communities that had managed to evacuate before this group arrived. Their reports painted a picture of an organization that was both ruthlessly efficient and completely without mercy for anyone who opposed them. Families separated, resources confiscated, and community leaders executed as examples to others. But the most disturbing intelligence was about their recruitment methods. The group was actively seeking out people with useful skills and forcing them to join their organization. Engineers, doctors, mechanics, anyone whose expertise could contribute to their expansion. Resistance meant death, but cooperation meant becoming complicit in their conquest of other communities. I realized that my background in supply chain management and logistics would make me exactly the kind of person they'd want to recruit. Carlos's maintenance skills, Maria's mechanical expertise, Rebecca's organizational abilities, Sarah's medical training. All of us had capabilities that would be valuable to a group trying to control territory and resources. This meant that if they found us, we wouldn't just face destruction or absorption as a community. We'd face individual choices about whether to cooperate with people who represented everything we'd been trying to build an alternative to. The easy option would be to submit and hope they'd allow us to maintain some version of our community under their control. The harder option would be to resist and accept the consequences. On day 45, we received radio confirmation that the military group had reached the outskirts of Columbus. They were now less than 50 miles from our location and moving steadily north. Intelligence from other communities suggested they'd reach our area within a week to 10 days. Jennifer's alliance had grown to include 6 survivor communities, representing about 200 people total. But even combined, we didn't have the weapons or military organization to resist a group that had been absorbing resources and personnel. For weeks, our only advantages were knowledge of local terrain and the defensive positions we'd prepared. The Alliance leadership met to discuss our options, and the conversation was sobering. We could try to evacuate everyone to locations further north, but that would mean abandoning the infrastructure and supplies we'd worked so hard to establish. We could try to hide and hope the military group would pass us by, but discovery would mean facing them without preparation or coordination. Or we could make a stand and try to inflict enough damage to convince them that conquering our communities would cost more than it was worth. It was a desperate option that would probably result in heavy casualties, but it might be the only way to preserve some version of the life we'd built from the ashes of the old world. As I looked around the room at the representatives of 6 communities that had chosen to work together rather than prey on each other, I realized we were facing the moment that would define what kind of world would emerge from this crisis. Would it be a world where strength determined survival and cooperation was a luxury no one could afford? Or would it be a world where people could still choose to help each other, even when it would be easier to take what they needed by force? The radio crackled with an incoming transmission that made everyone in the room freeze. It was a broadcast on an open frequency, clearly intended for any survivor communities in the region to hear. The voice was calm, professional, and absolutely terrifying in its certainty. The message was simple. All survivor communities in central Ohio had 72 hours to send representatives to negotiate terms of incorporation into what they called the Ohio Recovery Authority. Communities that failed to send representatives would be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly. Resistance to lawful authority during a declared emergency would result in immediate pacification of the area. As the transmission ended and we sat in stunned silence, I realized that everything we'd built over the past 45 days was about to be tested in ways I'd never imagined when I first decided to stay at the warehouse instead of going home to my apartment. The choices we made in the next 72 hours would determine whether our community survived as something recognizable or disappeared into an organization that represented everything we'd been trying to resist. The 72-hour ultimatum from the Ohio Recovery Authority forced us to make the most difficult decision any of us had faced since the eruption. Send representatives to negotiate our surrender, or prepare for a war we probably couldn't win against people who had been systematically conquering every survivor community in their path. Jennifer called an emergency meeting of the Alliance leadership at the school building that served as our unofficial headquarters. Representatives from all 6 communities gathered in what used to be the school library, surrounded by children's books and educational posters that felt like artifacts from a world that no longer existed. The debate was intense and sometimes heated. 3 of the communities wanted to send negotiators and try to work out terms that would allow them to maintain some autonomy under the authorities' control. They argued that resistance would mean certain death for everyone, including the children and elderly people we were supposed to be protecting. 2 communities wanted to evacuate immediately, abandoning their established positions and trying to reach areas that might be outside the authorities' expanding territory. They believed that any negotiation would result in absorption and eventual dissolution of our independent communities. Our processing plant community was the 6th vote, and the decision fell to me as the person the others looked to for leadership. I had to choose between 3 options that all carried enormous risks for the 19 people who had trusted me to keep them alive. I thought about everything we'd built over the past 6 weeks. The systems we'd developed for sharing resources and making decisions. The relationships we'd formed between people who had started as strangers, but become something closer than family. The hope we'd maintained that it was possible to create something better from the ruins of the old world. Then I thought about what absorption into the Authority would mean. Based on the radio intelligence we'd gathered, the Authority operated as a military hierarchy where individual communities lost their identity and autonomy. Resources were centralized and redistributed according to organizational priorities rather than community needs. People were assigned roles based on their utility to the larger organization rather than their personal preferences or family situations. Most importantly, the Authority's expansion strategy depended on eliminating any alternative models of survival and community organization. They couldn't allow independent communities to exist because those communities represented proof that people could survive and thrive without submitting to military control. I cast our vote for resistance, but with a strategic approach that might give us a chance of success. We wouldn't wait for the Authority to attack us at locations of their choosing. We would take the initiative and strike at their supply lines and communications, making it costly for them to operate in our region while they were still consolidating their recent conquests. The Alliance voted 4-2 in favor of resistance, but the 2 communities that wanted to evacuate were granted permission to do so with our full support. We helped them plan routes to areas that might be safer, and we gave them supplies and equipment they'd need for the journey. It was heartbreaking to see our coalition fragment just when we needed unity most, but I couldn't force people to fight if they believed evacuation offered better chances for their families. The next 48 hours were devoted to preparing for asymmetric warfare against a superior force. We had detailed maps of the region from our distribution and trucking experience. We had radio equipment that would allow coordination between our scattered positions. Most importantly, we had knowledge of local terrain and infrastructure that the Authority couldn't have acquired during their rapid advance. Carlos and Maria led teams that cached supplies and ammunition at strategic locations throughout our area. If our main positions were overrun, we have the resources needed to continue resistance from hidden bases. Rebecca organized our communications network, establishing protocols for secure transmissions and backup frequencies if our primary channels were compromised. The medical personnel from Jennifer's community set up field hospitals in concealed locations where wounded fighters could receive treatment without compromising our main defensive positions. Sarah coordinated with them to ensure that all our combat medics had the training and supplies they'd need to save lives under fire. But the most difficult task was preparing the non-combatants in our communities for what was coming. We had to plan for the possibility that our defensive positions might be overrun and our fighters killed or captured. The children, elderly, and others who couldn't fight needed escape routes and hiding places that would keep them alive if everything else failed. I found myself having conversations with parents about what would happen to their children if the worst occurred. We developed plans for evacuating the most vulnerable members of our communities to remote locations where they might survive even if our organized resistance was defeated. It was planning for scenarios I hoped would never happen, but leadership means preparing for the worst while working for the best. Day 47 brought our first direct contact with Authority forces. A reconnaissance team of 6 vehicles approached Jennifer's school, building flying flags with the Authority's symbol, a stylized eagle clutching arrows and grain. They set up a perimeter around the school and used loudspeakers to demand that community representatives come out for negotiations. Jennifer made the decision to meet with them, but under carefully controlled conditions. She approached their perimeter alone, carrying a white flag, and insisted that the negotiations take place in neutral territory where neither side had tactical advantages. The authority representatives agreed, probably because they were confident in their overwhelming superiority. What Jennifer learned during that meeting confirmed our worst fears about what submission to the authority would mean. They weren't offering genuine negotiation about terms of cooperation. They were demanding complete integration of our communities into their organizational structure, with all resources transferred to central control and all personnel assigned roles according to authority priorities. Community leaders would be replaced by authority administrators. Existing relationships and family structures would be reorganized according to efficiency considerations. Anyone with useful skills would be relocated to positions where those skills could best serve the authority's expansion plans, regardless of personal preferences or family connections. But the most chilling aspect of their offer was what they called the loyalty verification process. Everyone in the absorbed communities would be evaluated for their commitment to authority principles and their potential for future resistance. Those who passed would be accepted as full members with access to food, shelter, and protection. Those who failed would be classified as security risks and dealt with accordingly. Jennifer asked what happened to people who were classified as security risks, and the authority representative's answer was coldly bureaucratic. They were relocated to areas where they could contribute to organizational goals without posing threats to community stability. When Jennifer pressed for specifics, she was told that security classifications were internal matters not subject to outside review. The message was clear: submit completely or face elimination, but the elimination would be carried out systematically and bureaucratically rather than through obvious violence. People would simply disappear into the authority's administrative machinery, and their communities would be told they'd been relocated for everyone's benefit. Jennifer returned from the meeting with a 48-hour deadline for our final answer. If we agreed to submit, authority personnel would arrive to begin the integration process. If we refused, the area would be pacified and reorganized under direct military administration. That night, I called together the leadership of our remaining 4 communities for what I knew might be our last meeting as independent entities. We sat in the processing plant's conference room, surrounded by maps and radio equipment, planning for a battle that would determine whether our experiment in cooperative survival would continue or become another footnote in the authority's expansion. The plan we developed was based on our only significant advantages: knowledge of local terrain and the element of surprise. The authority expected us to either submit or wait passively for their attack. Instead, we would strike first at their communications and supply lines, disrupting their coordination and forcing them to fight on terms that favored smaller, more mobile forces. Carlos had identified 3 critical targets within striking distance of our positions: a radio relay station that coordinated authority communications across central Ohio, a fuel depot that supplied their vehicles and generators, a command post that controlled their operations in our region. Simultaneous attacks on all 3 targets might cripple their ability to conduct coordinated operations against our communities. But these attacks would also mean crossing a line from which there could be no return. Once we struck authority assets, we'd be committed to total resistance with no possibility of negotiation or compromise. Everyone involved in the attacks would be marked for elimination, and their families and communities would face collective punishment. I volunteered to lead the attack on the communications relay, partly because my knowledge of distribution networks had helped identify the target, but mostly because I couldn't ask others to take risks I wasn't willing to accept myself. Carlos and Maria insisted on joining the mission, along with 2 volunteers from Jennifer's community who had military experience. The attack was scheduled for dawn on day 50, timed to coincide with the authorities' deadline for our response. While they were waiting for our surrender, we'd be destroying their ability to coordinate the pacification of our region. It was a desperate gamble, but desperation was becoming our normal operating condition. The night before the attack, I walked through the processing plant, saying goodbye to people who had become my family over the past 7 weeks. Sarah was preparing medical supplies for the casualties we expected to suffer. Rebecca was encoding messages for transmission to survivor communities outside our region, warnings about the authorities' methods and maybe inspiration for their own resistance. The newest family we'd taken in, the parents with 3 young children, were helping prepare emergency evacuation kits for the non-combatants. The father pulled me aside to thank me for accepting them into our community and to promise that if I didn't return from the mission, he'd do everything possible to help the others reach safety. It was a conversation that crystallized everything we'd been fighting for since the first day at the warehouse. We weren't just trying to survive as individuals. We were trying to preserve the possibility that people could choose cooperation over domination, even when domination seemed safer and more practical. At 3:00 in the morning on day 50, our strike teams left their bases and began moving toward their targets through terrain we'd mapped and practiced on for the past week. The radio relay station was located on a hilltop about 12 miles from the processing plant, defended by what our reconnaissance suggested was a small security detail. The approach took 2 hours of careful movement through frozen fields and ash-covered woods. The temperature was 30 degrees below zero, and the falling ash made it difficult to see more than a few yards in any direction. But the same conditions that made our approach difficult also provided concealment from the authorities' sentries. We reached the perimeter of the relay station just as the sky was beginning to lighten with the gray dawn that had replaced sunrise. Since the eruption, the facility consisted of a small building housing the radio equipment, a generator shed, and a communications tower that rose about 100 feet above the hilltop. The security detail was exactly what our intelligence had predicted. 4 guards in a wooden structure that offered protection from the weather, but limited visibility of the surrounding area. They were equipped with automatic weapons and radio equipment that would allow them to call for reinforcements, but they clearly weren't expecting an attack. Our plan was simple, but required precise timing. Carlos and the 2 volunteers would neutralize the guards, while Maria and I destroyed the radio equipment and tower. We had explosives salvaged from construction sites and timers that would allow us to escape before the charges detonated. The attack began at exactly 6:00 in the morning. Carlos's team approached the guard post from 2 directions, using the limited visibility to get within striking distance before being detected. The guards were eliminated quickly and quietly, preventing them from transmitting warnings to other authority positions. Maria and I entered the radio building and began placing charges on the equipment that controlled communications across the region. The facility was more sophisticated than we'd expected, with backup systems and redundant connections that required additional demolition to ensure complete destruction. But as we were completing our work, Maria spotted vehicles approaching the base of the hill. Authority reinforcements were arriving earlier than our intelligence had predicted, probably as part of routine shift changes rather than in response to our attack. We had maybe 10 minutes before they reached the relay station and discovered what we'd done. I made the decision to detonate the charges immediately rather than risk capture or failure of the mission. The explosions destroyed the radio equipment and brought down the communications tower, eliminating the authorities' ability to coordinate operations across central Ohio. But the early detonation also meant we had to escape on foot while authority personnel were actively searching for the attackers. The retreat was a nightmare of cold, exhaustion, and constant fear of discovery. We moved through terrain that offered concealment, but slowed our progress toward the rally point where vehicles were waiting to extract us. Authority patrols were converging on the area, and radio chatter indicated they were coordinating a systematic search of the entire region. Carlos took a bullet in the shoulder during one close encounter with an authority patrol, but he remained mobile and refused to be left behind. Maria twisted her ankle badly during our descent from the hilltop, and she had to be assisted for the final 3 miles to the extraction point. But we made it. All 5 members of the strike team reached the rally point and were evacuated to a concealed position where we could monitor the results of our attacks and plan our next moves. Radio intercepts confirmed that all 3 targets had been hit successfully, and authority communications were in chaos as they tried to re-establish coordination. The immediate tactical success felt good, but I knew we'd also triggered a response that would test our communities in ways we might not survive. The authority couldn't allow successful resistance to their expansion, both for strategic reasons and because other communities might be inspired to resist if they saw that opposition was possible. Over the next 6 hours, radio intercepts revealed the scope of the retaliation we'd provoked. The authority was mobilizing every available unit for systematic attacks on all known survivor communities in Central Ohio. They were no longer interested in negotiated submissions or gradual integration. They wanted to eliminate resistance completely and establish absolute control over the region. But our attacks had also revealed something important about the authority's organizational structure. They were heavily dependent on centralized communications and logistics, and disrupting those systems created opportunities for smaller forces to operate effectively against their larger units. More importantly, our success was being noticed by other survivor communities across Ohio and neighboring states. Radio transmissions from groups we'd never had contact with were referencing our attacks and discussing the possibility of coordinated resistance to authority expansion. Jennifer's radio network was picking up intelligence about authority forces being diverted from other areas to deal with the situation in Central Ohio. This suggested that their expansion was being slowed by the need to suppress our resistance, which might give other communities time to prepare their own defenses or evacuate to safer areas. Day 51 brought the authorities' response to our attacks. A force of approximately 200 personnel with heavy weapons and vehicles began systematic assaults on the positions our communities had prepared. But instead of the coordinated operation they'd planned, the attacks were poorly synchronized because of the communications disruption we'd achieved. The battle for Jennifer's school lasted 8 hours and resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. The authority eventually overran the position, but at a cost that left them unable to immediately assault the other communities in our alliance. Jennifer and most of her people escaped to secondary positions we'd prepared, but they lost most of their supplies and equipment. The processing plant came under attack on day 52, and the assault revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of our defensive preparations. The facility's concrete construction provided excellent protection against small arms fire, but the authority brought explosives and heavy weapons that could breach our walls. The fighting was brutal and personal in ways that nothing in my experience as a distribution manager had prepared me for. I found myself making split-second decisions about life and death while trying to coordinate our defense and maintain communication with our other positions. Carlos was magnificent during the battle, directing our limited firepower with tactical skill that kept the authority forces from overwhelming our positions, despite their numerical superiority. Maria kept our communications working even after several direct hits on our radio equipment. Sarah and Rebecca organized the evacuation of wounded defenders and non-combatants to escape routes we'd prepared for exactly this situation. But by the afternoon of day 52, it was clear that we couldn't hold the processing plant against sustained assault. The authority had brought enough firepower to reduce our defensive positions to rubble, and they showed no signs of being willing to accept the casualties required for a negotiated withdrawal. I made the hardest decision of my life. I ordered the evacuation of the processing plant and the destruction of everything we couldn't take with us. We would abandon the facility that had been our home and our fortress, but we would deny its resources to the authority and preserve our community's ability to continue resistance from other locations. The evacuation was carried out under fire, with authority forces pressing their attack, even as we tried to move our wounded and our most vulnerable community members to safety. We lost 3 people during the withdrawal, including one of the college students who had been with us since the early days at the warehouse. As we reached our fallback positions and watched smoke rising from the processing plant we'd turned into a home, I realized that we'd lost the battle, but maybe not the war. The authority controlled the territory they'd attacked, but they'd paid a higher price than they'd expected, and they still faced ongoing resistance from forces they couldn't locate or eliminate. More importantly, our resistance had demonstrated to other communities across the region that the authority wasn't invincible. Radio traffic indicated that several other survivor groups were organizing their own defensive preparations, and some were actively planning attacks on authority assets in their areas. Day 53 brought intelligence that changed our entire strategic situation. Radio intercepts revealed that the authority was facing resistance in multiple locations across Ohio, and their expansion had stalled as they diverted resources to suppress uprisings they hadn't anticipated. But the same intelligence also revealed that they were receiving reinforcements and supplies from outside Ohio, suggesting that the authority was part of a larger organization with resources that extended well beyond our region. Our local resistance had succeeded in disrupting their immediate plans, but it had also escalated our conflict to a level that might involve forces we couldn't hope to match. Jennifer and I met at a concealed location to assess our situation and plan our next moves. Our 4 allied communities had been reduced to scattered groups of survivors operating from hidden bases. We'd lost most of our supplies and equipment, and several of our most capable fighters had been killed or seriously wounded. But we'd also proven that organized resistance was possible, and we'd inspired similar efforts across the region. The question was whether we could sustain and coordinate this resistance long enough to either defeat the authority or force them to abandon their expansion into areas where the cost of conquest exceeded the benefits. As we sat in a cold, dark shelter discussing these strategic questions, I thought about how much had changed since I first decided to stay at the warehouse instead of going home to my apartment. I'd started as someone trying to help a few desperate people survive the immediate crisis of the eruption. Now I was planning guerrilla warfare against a military organization that controlled most of central Ohio. But I'd also learned something important about leadership and community during those 53 days. The relationships we'd built, the systems we'd developed, and the values we'd maintained hadn't been destroyed by our military defeats. They'd been strengthened by the shared experience of fighting for something worth preserving. The authority could conquer our territory and destroy our facilities, but they couldn't eliminate what we'd proven was possible. People could choose cooperation over domination. Communities could operate according to principles of mutual aid rather than hierarchical control. Resistance to organized oppression was both possible and necessary, even when the odds seemed hopeless. As radio reports came in about authority forces regrouping for expanded operations against survivor communities throughout the region, I realized that our conflict was entering a new phase that would test everything we'd learned about survival, community, and resistance in the world that was emerging from the ashes of the old one. The guerrilla phase of our resistance began on day 54 when Jennifer and I made the decision that changed everything about how we approached survival in the new world. Instead of trying to hold territory against superior forces, we would become ghosts in the landscape, striking at authority assets and disappearing before they could respond effectively. Our scattered communities had been reduced to about 60 people operating from concealed bases throughout central Ohio. We'd lost most of our infrastructure and supplies, but we'd gained something more valuable: the knowledge that the authority could be hurt and the experience of working together under the most extreme conditions imaginable. The intelligence we gathered over the next week revealed both opportunities and dangers that would shape our strategy for the months ahead. The authorities' expansion had indeed stalled as they dealt with resistance across multiple states, but they were also adapting their methods to counter the tactics that had proven effective against them. Radio intercepts indicated that they were establishing fortified bases at key transportation and communication nodes, making it harder for resistance groups to disrupt their operations. They were also implementing collective punishment policies against communities suspected of supporting resistance activities, which meant our actions could have consequences for people who weren't directly involved in our operations. But the most significant development was the intelligence we received about other resistance groups operating across the region. Our attacks on the authorities' communications infrastructure had helped establish contact between survivor communities that had been isolated since the eruption, and a larger network of opposition was beginning to emerge. Jennifer's radio network connected us with resistance cells in Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia. Some were organized around existing communities like ours, while others consisted of refugees from conquered areas who had escaped authority control and were operating as mobile guerrilla units. The coordination of this broader resistance created opportunities we couldn't have achieved as isolated local groups. Intelligence could be shared across hundreds of miles, allowing U.S. to identify patterns in authority operations and plan attacks that would have maximum strategic impact. Resources could be coordinated, with communities that had surplus supplies supporting those that were operating with minimal equipment. Most importantly, the psychological impact of coordinated resistance was beginning to affect authority morale and recruitment. Radio intercepts revealed growing concerns among authority leadership about the sustainability of their expansion strategy when every conquered territory required ongoing military presence to suppress resistance. Day 60 brought our first coordinated multi-state operation against authority infrastructure. Intelligence from the regional resistance network had identified a critical supply convoy that would be transporting ammunition and fuel from authority bases in Indiana to support operations in Ohio and Pennsylvania. The convoy consisted of 12 vehicles with military escorts, following a route that would take them through territory where multiple resistance cells could coordinate attacks. The plan was to strike simultaneously at 3 points along the route, destroying as much of the convoy as possible while minimizing casualties to our forces. My team was responsible for this central ambush point, where the convoy would be most vulnerable as it crossed a bridge that offered no alternative routes. Carlos had recovered from his shoulder wound and was leading our assault group, while Maria coordinated communications with the other strike teams. The attack required precise timing and coordination across distances that made radio communication difficult and unreliable. Each team had to execute their part of the operation based on predetermined schedules, trusting that the others would fulfill their responsibilities without direct confirmation until after the mission was complete. We positioned ourselves near the bridge 2 hours before the convoy was scheduled to arrive, concealed in positions that would allow us to escape quickly after the attack. The weather was working in our favor, with heavy ash fall that reduced visibility and muffled sound, making it harder for the authority escorts to detect our presence. The convoy appeared exactly on schedule, moving at moderate speed with scout vehicles ahead and behind the main group of supply trucks. The escorts were alert and well armed, but they were also following predictable patterns that our intelligence network had observed and documented over several similar operations. The attack began when the lead vehicles reached the center of the bridge, where they couldn't retreat or advance quickly enough to escape the kill zone we'd established. Explosives placed under the bridge structure disabled 2 of the escort vehicles, while our assault team engaged the remaining escorts with weapons we'd captured from previous operations. The battle lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours of intense violence that tested every skill we'd developed during our weeks of guerrilla operations. Authority personnel fought with professional discipline, but they were caught in a tactical situation that favored our knowledge of local terrain and our ability to disengage rapidly when resistance became too strong. When the shooting stopped, we destroyed 8 of the 12 vehicles in the convoy and captured supplies that would sustain our operations for weeks. More importantly, we demonstrated that coordinated resistance could inflict significant damage on authority logistics even when they took extensive security precautions. But the victory came at a cost that reminded me why every success in this new world carried the seeds of future tragedy. We lost 2 people during the attack, including Rebecca, whose accounting skills and calm personality had been essential to our community's survival since the early days at the warehouse. Rebecca died trying to rescue medical supplies from one of the burning supply trucks, supplies that could have saved lives in the field hospitals that supported our resistance operations. Her death embodied both the heroism and the heartbreak that defined everything we were trying to accomplish in a world where good people died for good reasons. The intelligence we gathered from the captured convoy revealed information that changed our understanding of what we were fighting against. Documents and radio equipment showed that the authority was much larger and better organized than we'd realized, with operations extending across most of the former United States and coordination with similar organizations in other countries. The volcanic winter had triggered the collapse of existing governments worldwide, and military organizations like the Authority were filling the vacuum by establishing control over territories and populations. Our local resistance was part of a global struggle between centralized military control and community-based survival strategies. But the captured intelligence also revealed weaknesses in the Authority's expansion strategy that offered hope for long-term resistance success. Their rapid growth had outpaced their ability to establish stable administrative control over conquered territories, and they were facing logistical challenges that limited their ability to project force effectively over large distances. More importantly, intelligence reports indicated growing resistance to authority policies within their own organization. Military personnel who had joined during the early crisis were becoming disillusioned with the harsh methods required to maintain control over unwilling populations, and some were defecting to resistance groups or simply deserting their posts. Day 68 brought news that fundamentally altered our strategic situation. Radio transmissions from the East Coast indicated that the federal government was attempting to re-establish control from secure facilities that had survived the initial crisis, and they were declaring all military organizations like the Authority to be illegal usurpers of legitimate governmental authority. This development created opportunities and dangers that we hadn't anticipated. Federal forces might provide support for resistance operations against the Authority, but they might also attempt to impose their own control over territories that had developed independent survival strategies. More immediately, the conflict between federal forces and the Authority was likely to intensify military operations across the region, which would increase dangers for civilian populations and resistance groups caught between competing military organizations. Jennifer and I spent several days discussing how this development should affect our operations and long-term strategy. Our immediate goal remained the same: protect our communities and maintain their independence from any form of authoritarian control. But the emergence of federal forces added complexity to a situation that was already testing our resources and capabilities. The decision we made was to continue our resistance operations against the Authority while maintaining neutrality toward federal forces unless they threatened our communities directly. We would share intelligence about Authority activities with federal units when such cooperation served our interests, but we wouldn't subordinate our operations to federal command or accept federal control over our territories. This strategy proved prescient when federal reconnaissance units reached our area on day 71 and attempted to establish contact with our resistance network. The federal representatives offered military support and coordination against Authority forces, but they also made it clear that they expected resistance groups to accept federal authority once the immediate crisis was resolved. I met with the federal representatives under a flag of truce at a neutral location, accompanied by Carlos and 2 other community leaders. The federal officers were professional and clearly committed to re-establishing constitutional government, but they also represented a return to the centralized systems that had failed to prevent or respond effectively to the volcanic crisis. The federal offer was tempting from a tactical standpoint. They had resources and firepower that could help us defeat authority forces in our region, and they offered legal recognition for our resistance activities under federal emergency authorities. But acceptance would mean giving up the independence and self-determination that had motivated our resistance from the beginning. I explained to the federal representatives that our communities were willing to cooperate against the common threat represented by the authority, but we weren't prepared to surrender the autonomy we'd fought so hard to preserve. We would continue our resistance operations according to our own strategic priorities, and we would welcome federal assistance that supported those operations without compromising our independence. The federal officers weren't happy with our position, but they agreed to limited cooperation against authority targets when our interests aligned. This arrangement gave us access to intelligence and resources that improved our operational effectiveness, while maintaining the flexibility to pursue our own objectives when federal priorities conflicted with community needs. Day 75 brought the largest coordinated resistance operation we'd attempted since the beginning of our guerrilla campaign. Intelligence from multiple sources indicated that the authority was planning a major offensive against remaining resistance strongholds across Ohio, and we decided to preempt their operation with simultaneous attacks on their command and logistics infrastructure. The target was the authority's regional headquarters, located in a fortified compound outside of Columbus that coordinated military operations across central Ohio. Destroying or capturing this facility would disrupt authority operations for weeks and might force them to abandon their planned offensive against resistance communities. But the mission also represented our greatest risk since the evacuation of the processing plant. The headquarters was heavily defended and located in territory under complete authority control. Reaching the target would require penetrating multiple security perimeters, and escape after the attack would be extremely difficult, even if the operation succeeded. I volunteered to lead the assault team, partly because my knowledge of the Columbus area transportation network was essential to the mission planning, but mostly because I couldn't ask others to accept risks I wasn't willing to face myself. Carlos and Maria insisted on joining the mission, along with 8 volunteers from various communities in our resistance network. The approach to the target took 18 hours of careful movement through territory patrolled by authority forces. We traveled in small groups using different routes, carrying only essential equipment and relying on hidden supply caches established by resistance supporters in the Columbus area. The compound itself was more heavily fortified than our intelligence had indicated, with multiple rings of defensive positions and electronic surveillance systems that made undetected approach extremely difficult. But weeks of guerrilla operations had taught us to adapt our tactics based on actual conditions rather than predetermined plans. We modified our approach to focus on creating maximum disruption rather than attempting to capture or hold the facility. Explosive charges placed at critical points in the compound's infrastructure would destroy communications equipment, vehicles, and supply storage areas, while allowing our assault team to escape before authority reinforcements could respond effectively. The attack began at 2:00 in the morning when authority personnel would be at minimum alertness and reaction capability. Our assault team penetrated the outer perimeter using techniques we'd learned during previous operations, placing charges at predetermined targets while avoiding direct confrontation with security forces. The explosions were perfectly timed to create cascading failures in the compound's defensive systems. Communications towers collapsed, cutting off contact with authority units across the region. Vehicle parks erupted in flames that spread to adjacent structures. The main headquarters building suffered structural damage that made it uninhabitable without extensive repairs. But as we were withdrawing from the compound, authority reinforcements arrived sooner than our intelligence had predicted. We found ourselves engaged in running battles through the streets of Columbus, fighting our way toward extraction points while authority forces attempted to surround and capture our assault team. The urban warfare was brutal and chaotic, requiring split-second decisions about routes and tactics in an environment where every wrong turn could mean death or capture. Carlos was wounded again, this time more seriously, and had to be carried by other team members during the final stages of our escape. We lost 3 people during the withdrawal, including Maria, who sacrificed herself to hold off authority pursuit while the rest of the team reached safety. Maria had been with our community since the early days at the warehouse, and her mechanical expertise had been crucial to our survival through every phase of the crisis. Her death was devastating both personally and practically, but it also embodied the courage and selflessness that had defined our community from the beginning. Maria died ensuring that others could continue the struggle for independence and self-determination that had motivated our resistance from the first day of the authorities' ultimatum. The intelligence we captured during the headquarters raid revealed that our resistance operations had been more effective than we'd realized. Authority plans for expanded offensive operations had been postponed indefinitely due to the logistical disruption caused by ongoing resistance activities across multiple states. More importantly, the captured documents showed that authority leadership was beginning to question the sustainability of their expansion strategy. The resources required to suppress resistance and maintain control over conquered territories were exceeding the benefits they gained from territorial expansion. Day 87 brought the breakthrough that changed everything about our strategic situation. Radio transmissions from the federal forces indicated that they had re-established contact with international allies who were providing military assistance for operations against the authority and similar organizations worldwide. The volcanic winter was beginning to show signs of ending as the ash clouds slowly dispersed and sunlight started penetrating the atmospheric debris. Agricultural experts believed that limited food production might be possible within the next growing season, which would reduce the scarcity that had driven much of the conflict since the eruption. But most importantly, the combination of federal military operations, international assistance, and ongoing resistance activities was forcing authority leadership to consider negotiated settlements rather than continued military expansion. Cost of maintaining control over hostile populations was becoming prohibitive even for an organization with significant military resources. Jennifer and I received an invitation to participate in peace negotiations between federal representatives, authority leadership, and resistance groups from across the region. The negotiations would address territorial boundaries, resource allocation, and governance structures for areas that had developed independent survival strategies during the crisis. The decision to participate in negotiations represented a fundamental shift from military resistance to political engagement, but it also offered the possibility of achieving our core objectives through diplomatic means rather than continued warfare. If successful, the negotiations could result in formal recognition of community autonomy within a broader framework of regional cooperation. I made the decision to attend the negotiations as a representative of our resistance network, despite concerns that the meeting might be a trap designed to eliminate resistance leadership. The opportunity to secure legal protection for our communities and their independence was worth the personal risk involved in leaving our secure positions. The negotiations took place at a neutral location in Pennsylvania, mediated by international observers who had arrived with federal reinforcements. Representatives from dozens of communities and resistance groups, gathered to discuss the future of territories that had been contested between federal authority, military organizations like the Authority, and independent survivor communities. The discussions were complex and sometimes contentious, involving fundamental questions about governance, resource allocation, and the balance between security and freedom in a world still recovering from civilizational collapse. But they also represented something unprecedented: the possibility of creating new social structures based on lessons learned during the crisis, rather than simply restoring the systems that had failed to prevent or respond to the volcanic disaster. After 2 weeks of intensive negotiations, we reached agreements that established autonomous zones within the broader framework of federal jurisdiction. Communities that had demonstrated effective self-governance during the crisis would maintain control over their internal affairs while accepting federal coordination for defense, inter-community trade, and resource sharing. The Authority agreed to withdraw from territories where they faced ongoing resistance in exchange for amnesty for their personnel and recognition of their control over areas where their administration had been accepted by local populations. It wasn't a complete victory for either side, but it offered the possibility of ending the warfare that had consumed so many lives and resources. Day 90 found me back at our concealed base in central Ohio, preparing to implement the agreements reached during the Pennsylvania negotiations. Our scattered communities would be able to emerge from hiding and begin rebuilding the infrastructure and relationships that had been disrupted by months of guerrilla warfare. But the real victory wasn't the diplomatic recognition or the territorial autonomy we'd secured through negotiation. It was the demonstration that people could choose cooperation over domination, even under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Communities could operate according to principles of mutual aid and shared decision-making, even when authoritarian alternatives seemed more practical or secure. As I recorded this account of our first 90 days after the eruption, I reflected on everything we'd learned about leadership, community, and survival in a world that had been transformed beyond recognition. The sun was beginning to penetrate the ash cloud more regularly, offering hope that the volcanic winter might be ending and that agricultural production could resume. Our communities had survived not just the environmental catastrophe, but the social and political upheaval that followed. We'd maintained our values and our commitment to each other through warfare, displacement, and negotiations that determined our future. Most importantly, we'd proven that alternatives to authoritarian control were possible even when civilization itself seemed to be collapsing. The road ahead would bring new challenges as we worked to rebuild sustainable communities in a world still recovering from global catastrophe. Climate conditions remained harsh, infrastructure needed extensive repair, and relationships between different groups required ongoing attention to prevent future conflicts. But we'd also established something that couldn't be destroyed by military force or bureaucratic decree. We'd created proof that human beings could choose solidarity over selfishness, cooperation over competition, and hope over despair, even when everything familiar had been swept away by forces beyond anyone's control. If you're out there listening to this recording, facing your own crisis or contemplating the possibility of social collapse, remember what we learned during those 90 days. Communities can survive and thrive when people commit to taking care of each other. Leadership means serving others rather than controlling them. Resistance to oppression is both possible and necessary, even when the odds seem hopeless. The world ended, but we didn't. And that's where the real story begins.